You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 31st of May, 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist, in association with UBS. It's 1300 in Seoul, 8 a.m. in Amsterdam, 7 a.m. here at Midori House in London, and 2 a.m. in Washington, D.C. You're listening to Monocle Radio. The Globalist starts now. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace.
Donald Trump, former president, current candidate, and now convicted criminal. He becomes the first president in US history to be found guilty on multiple criminal charges. We'll assess a significant moment in America's history. Also ahead on today's programme, Mexico goes to the polls in an election marred by bloodshed right to the last moment. Andrew Mueller tells us what we learned.
We learned that North Korea had lit upon a new way to be the world's worst neighbour, as hundreds of balloons bearing bagloads of waste were launched across the border, descending upon bemused South Koreans.
And say non to brie and cream and a big oui to quinoa and eating your greens. Right, the chefs at the Olympics are steering everyone clear of the unhealthy stuff. That's all ahead on The Globalist, live from London. And we begin straight away with the news that Donald Trump, the former US president, has been found guilty in all 34 counts in his hush money trial. He becomes the first US president in history to be found guilty of a crime. The 34 counts relate to falsifying business records to conceal a payment made to the former porn star Stormy Daniels. Well, to go through the news, I'm joined now by Scott Lucas, adjunct professor at the Clinton Institute, University College Dublin, and by my Monocle colleague Chris Chermak. A very good morning to you both.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Scott, if I can begin with you. I mean, this is a powerful moment in the history of the United States with Donald Trump a convicted criminal. What's your reaction?
I think, Emma, that my reaction is that the system worked. The legal system in New York worked. Donald Trump was convicted, not by other politicians, not by the media, but by a jury of 12 of his peers. He had the right and fulfilled that right to carry out a full defense inside the courtroom, and the legal system, allowing him that right, found him accountable for the payoff to the adult film star Stormy Daniels to interfere in the 2016 election. The American legal system as a whole worked. That despite all the attempts, including by Trump himself, to tear that system down, the attacks on the judges, the attacks on the jury, the attacks on the prosecutor, the attacks on the district attorney, the attacks on the judges and district attorneys' families, the legal clerk, the U.S. legal system still stands today. And I say that and I emphasize that, Emma, because we're in a very dangerous moment, which goes beyond this specific conviction and indeed the forthcoming criminal trials against Donald Trump. And that is Donald Trump will now try to use political spin, political manipulation, insults, invective. His supporters will do so as well, to lead the media by the nose, not to talk about the legal facts, about the legal accountability, about the legal system, but to try to bury that by saying, you have convicted me, and this is only making me stronger. Let's talk about how I'm going to become president in November.
Chris, Scott has a very good point here that we've been experiencing the maelstrom that's been surrounding Donald Trump's trial and his criminal adventures. But at the end of the day, there is a very strong sense that a sensible, cool-headed system, which is one of the great parts of society, actually did its job. You were there at the arraignment in New York, weren't you? I mean, was there a sense that the law and the legal process was going to hold fast for this? Because you said that at the time it was quite an atmosphere.
The scene outside of the courtroom at the time of the arraignment was quite the circus atmosphere, as you can imagine, with sort of pro-Trump and anti-Trump supporters. What I did find interesting at the time, to this point about the legal system holding, was that you would find some even Trump supporters who I spoke to at different arraignments. I was at a few of the arraignments of Donald Trump, who did say that they had faith in the judicial system. They had faith in judges to some degree. The one thing that I would caveat on that is many would say, well, it's New York. So you did have that kind of caveat. If Florida, say, were to do this, where another of his trials is happening, that would be a different matter, which does go into the politics that Scott is kind of alluding to here. The fact that we have this very factual, this point to say, yes, he has been convicted of a crime, the first president in history, the legal system worked. What you have, though, here in the United States at the moment is this divide between the politics and the legal, which is quite incredible, just also in terms of the rules, right, of how the U.S. is set up. The fact that a convicted felon in the United States can still run for president. There is nothing stopping him from serving as president as well. As a result of that, this thing has been weirdly priced into politics in America. Both Donald Trump's campaign and Joe Biden's campaign, for that matter, have simply said this matter will be decided in November at the ballot box. No calls for him to step down as the Republican candidate for president. And I do think that, at least from an outside perspective, is important to note. It just shows how, when Scott is talking there about the legal system working, it shows this distinction we have right now in the U.S. between the legal system and the politics, which is completely separate from the legal system at this point. But so at the end of the day, as incredible as it sounds, despite the fact of Donald Trump now being a convicted felon, this will be decided by an election.
So what happens now, Scott?
Well, first of all, while taking everything Chris says on board, and I'll get to that in just a minute, what happens now and what is decided now is not November's election. What happens now is that Judge One Merchant, having presided over the trial, will now take into account Trump's behavior. He'll take into account the jury's verdict. He will then impose sentence on July 11th. Each of those 34 counts, felony counts of falsifying business records, carries a sentence of up to 4 years in prison. Now, Donald Trump is not going to get 136 years in prison. Even if he got 4 years on each count, the sentences would be concurrent. In other words, he would serve a maximum of 4 years, but the sentence is quite likely to be less than that. And indeed, he may be effectively kept under house arrest or under monitoring. What will then happen beyond him being sentenced is that there will be an appeal. That appeal process will carry on even as we have the political campaign, and indeed probably beyond the election in November. So Trump will probably stay out of prison, even if the sentence was to be detention. We will then see where November's election plays out, because what will happen before November's election, and of course, if Trump gets elected, is that attempt to rip apart the legal process by precisely saying, oh, no, it doesn't matter. Only that vote in November mattered, to the extent that Donald Trump will pardon himself, if not legally, because it's disputed whether he can legally do it. He'll do it with a declaration that he is pardoned, indeed, that he is immune from any of the cases against him. And again, I return to this, that beyond this trial, as important as it is, this is the most important and possibly dangerous moment in American history since the end of the Civil War. Because it's not just a question about Trump trying to tear down the legal system. We're only 3.5 years away from him trying to tear down the entire American system with an attempted coup in January 2021. Because this is the distinction. You can choose the American system, political and legal, or you can choose Donald Trump, who does not accept that system and accepts only his rule. You cannot choose both.
What happens now in terms of the way that Donald Trump plays this is bolstered enormously by the way that his defense team ran the trial, which sort of ran the trial a little bit like they ran a political campaign, which is personal attacks, denials, etc., not really playing by the rules. But there is something really important here, is that Donald Trump's supporters are furious, and he is being seen, and he sees himself as a martyr of political persecution. This could get him an awful lot of support. It could get him an awful lot of money, and it could also get him an awful lot of exposure, which Biden lacks. And we are now, I can't quite believe we're talking about the fact that the former president is a convicted felon, does not seem to be remotely affected by his conviction in terms of his attempted journey towards the White House.
Again, also importantly to note there, because it is not just his supporters as voters who are not necessarily turned off by this, although we'll get to the polls in a moment, but also his supporters in the political system. Senator J.D. Vance, for example, one case of a Republican from Ohio. When you talk about what his defense case has made in this continues now too. J.D. Vance saying last night, we need to be subpoenaing Judge Merchant and his daughter. We need to investigate how this trial was done, suggesting that George Soros was involved in this case against New York. These are the kind of claims you have from supporters of Donald Trump in the political system. The top Republicans in the House of Representatives both immediately supported Donald Trump in this case, rather than in any way questioning or suggesting the fact that they now have a convicted felon leading their party should be a problem. This is what leads to then his supporters, in terms of voters, playing this down as well. And that will be the key, I think, absolutely, going forward, how his voters see this. You did have some polling ahead of this suggesting that even up to a quarter of Donald Trump's supporters would question their support for him if he was a convicted felon. That said, because of the style of reporting, particularly about this New York case, to say, oh, well, this was not as big a deal as the other ones, there is a likelihood that even those voters are going to fall back into line as the election nears and also go into this narrative that Donald Trump is being persecuted. It should be said, though, when you say Joe Biden doesn't have any support here, Joe Biden's campaign also immediately sent out a mailing asking for donations as a result of this from Donald Trump, of the conviction. So both sides are going to be playing this. They are going to be playing to their base. They are going to be playing to the frustrations here. And not just the frustrations, I think, to Scott's broader point here, absolutely. For those who are in the anti-Trump camp, this is a seminal moment in U.S. history that is going to lead at least a certain amount of people to respond to that and get on board.
Scott, finally turning to you, this is a narrative that will dominate the run-up to the presidential election. How much will it dominate and drown out anything else that American voters need to listen to and hear about?
That's really up to the media and whether it's going to be responsible. I think your initial point is quite right, that there are a number of very, very important issues beyond Donald Trump's accountability and any convictions. Whether you talk about immigration, the economy, whether you talk about women's rights, including abortion rights, LGBT rights, climate change, foreign policy crises from the Middle East to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, this is a vital moment for America and indeed for the world. But the broader point, and I'll come back to this, is that if the media, is led by the nose just simply to speculate about voters over and over and over, they're being led by Trump. That's Trump's game. The idea is, look, my base will save me, whatever happens. So stop speculating on it. Stop focusing on it. Focus on the legal side of this. When you highlight J.D. Vance, who just simply is attacking the judge's daughter, just like Trump did, or you highlight Mike Johnson, the House Speaker, who immediately bowed the knee and said, oh, no, this is all just political. You're playing into Trump's narrative. In other words, a message, especially to the U.S. media, do your damn job. Do your job to question, to call out those who tried to deviate, divert, and bury this process. Call out J.D. Vance for those attacks. Call out Donald Trump for those attacks. Not being pro or anti-Trump, but simply being in favor of responsibility and in favor that no American, even Donald Trump, should be above the law in an election year.
Scott Lucas and Chris Chermak, thank you so much for joining me on The Globalist. You're listening to Monocle Radio. Now, this weekend, Mexico makes history by electing its first female president. Either the favourite, Claudia Sheinbaum, or her opponent, Xochitl Gálvez, will take power. But the poll has been marred by one of the bloodiest campaigns the country has yet seen. Government figures suggest 22 people running for local office have been murdered across Mexico since last September, but non-governmental groups say the number is much higher. Well, I'm joined now by Oscar Guardiola Rivera, Professor in International Law and International Affairs at Birkbeck College here in London. A very good morning to you, Oscar.
Very good morning to you.
Very good to see you here in the studio. This has been a hugely violent campaign. Could you just recap what's happened?
Well, part of the violence is, of course, just a continuation of the power dynamics and the problems that not only Mexico, but other countries in the Americas face. I mean, we were just hearing about deep polarization in the United States elections. Well, that kind of polarization is not just a matter of language. South of the border, it becomes very, very real. And that's the kind of violence that we're seeing in Mexico.
So just explain to us a little bit about the kind of people who have been targeted and why.
Well, it's very interesting because it is mostly women. It is mostly people who go into politics, and that has to do with precisely the two stories that are playing out in this election. On the one hand, as you pointed out, well, history will be made. A woman will be elected. Mexico still has one of the highest rates of femicides in the Western Hemisphere. 11 women are killed every day in Mexico. And that is something that both candidates, but in particular Claudia Sheinbaum, has focused. She has been telling her potential voters about how bringing gender parity to the cabinet and allowing more women in power is changing the power dynamics of Mexico. Of course, she also says this is going to be a long process. It will take time. This is a cultural transformation. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, this also has to do with economics. And economics in Mexico, as in the rest of the hemisphere, also have to do with the drug business. But the drug business is just another business. And what you see is precisely the fact that people who have been winning further rights, who have seen the purchase power increase during the presidency of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, well, those are the kinds of movements that tend to be targeted.
And as a result, one wonders who is actually doing the deliberate, who is carrying out this violence. And you said that the targets are women, which is a surprise, one could argue, given the traditional pattern of politics in Mexico. But is there a coordinated, organised campaign against people, or is this just, as you have said before, part of what happens in Mexico, tragically?
In a sense, it's difficult to tell. Of course, it's very difficult to find out exactly who is responsible. But if you read the newspapers today, the Mexican newspapers, you read La Jornada, for instance, and AMLO himself is suggesting that there is a pattern. Perhaps he's also trying to use this politically, but there is some truth, at least, to the argument that the pattern has to do precisely with this attempt at a transformation of the machista political culture in Mexico, but also the hatred that has been expressed against the front runner, Claudia Sheinbaum. And this has to do with the fact that she is a woman, but also, importantly, because she represents the tendency towards social transformation, stronger, protections for workers, that kind of social transformation, which, of course, would mean that the traditional parties, the parties of the right, who are behind Xochitl Gálvez, will continue to be out of power. It is a matter of holding on to power or losing it.
Whoever wins this weekend, they have obviously an enormous task ahead. What is the likelihood that they can unite and calm Mexico?
There is a likelihood. It is there have been profound changes. Close to 4,000 people every day have been raised out of poverty during AMLO's administration, and that is why he is so popular. 66% of popularity. I mean, Biden would love to have those numbers, and that is precisely what is what explains the polls in favor of Sheinbaum. That kind of social transformation in favor of workers, in favor of the poorer people in the country. That's the big transformation that people are perceiving and which might guarantee the victory of Claudia Sheinbaum.
And will it make any difference to Mexico that the next president will be a woman?
It does make a difference. We have already seen that making a difference in other countries, whether it is Argentina or Brazil, and people know it in Mexico. When you go to her rallies, what you hear is La Primera, the first. She's going to be the first. This matters to people in Mexico, particularly to women.
Oscar Guardiola Rivera, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
We learned that North Korea had lit upon a new way to be the world's worst neighbour, as hundreds of balloons bearing bagloads of waste were launched across the border, descending upon bemused South Koreans.
Andrew Mueller will be here to wrap up the week's news in his own way. Stay tuned to The Globalist.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
.22 here in London. Let's continue now with today's newspapers. Joining me down the line from Istanbul is our Middle East correspondent, Ruth Michelson. Good morning, Ruth.
Good morning.
I think we have to look at the way that the world has covered the Trump verdict. What's caught your eye?
Well, I mean, let's start with the fact that it's the center of every homepage. I'm going to try and describe, just as one example, looking at Der Spiegel, the German outlet, which just has the word guilty in English, I might add, 34 times, and a picture of Donald Trump. And some, then a series of details underneath, like questions about whether the Secret Service would have to come with him to prison. And the headline, Trump begs for donations after guilty verdict. There's, for example, the Turkish outlet, which has Trump becomes the first former US president convicted of felony crimes. I would say that using the term felony and crimes is a contradiction, but whatever, maybe they know more than me. So, for example, the homepage of El País, a little bit more direct. Trump guilty of 34 crimes for buying the silence of a porn actress. And then next to it, a piece entitled Trump could go to jail and still be president, and a sort of rundown of how the US Constitution does not prevent a person who's been convicted in a criminal trial for running for office or, in the words of El País, moving into the White House.
Is there any sort of less than neutral reaction to this? Because there's clearly this is dividing America. This shall divide America. They're even further. But the way that most of the large broadsheet papers have covered this is, as you'd say, and it's sort of like shocking in its neutrality. Guilty, convicted, the whole thing. Has any paper stood out and started to push around with its take on it?
Well, I mean, one thing that I've sort of noticed from reading the French media in general is that maybe this is part of the French language, but it's that the level of language used is a little bit more breathless. It's a bit more artistic. So lots and lots of mentions of this idea of the world first. But for example, Le Figaro, which is a sort of right-leaning French broadsheet, would say that basically they have a lead that's like, reason would dictate that there is a before and after the 30th of May. They list other key dates in history, and then it's very, very artful. It's sort of this big, like, this is the big moment of a page turning in history. Le Monde, sort of centrist French broadsheet, they talk about this that this verdict is ringing through American history. So the language is pretty heightened. And it's quite interesting to me that then I thought, well, I'll have a look at what some of the papers outside of Western Europe are saying. So, for example, if you go on to the homepage of the South China Morning Post, it's not the center of the homepage. You have to scroll down a little bit, then some very straight down the line reporting. And worth mentioning that the Russian outlet TASS, which is the Russian news agency, has put the news of the verdict underneath a story about Joe Biden and Ukrainian weapons. And again, a very sort of straight down the line news story that just says that, New York jurors found the former US president guilty.
Let's move on to some other stories making the headlines. There's an article which you want to draw our attention to, namely because you've written it, in The Guardian about Egypt's reaction to Israel taking over a buffer zone.
Yes, thank you for recognizing my own work, and I will do the same. That essentially this is about the reaction in Egypt and among Egyptian officials to Israel seizing control of what's called the Philadelphia Corridor, which is a small strip of land that is at the southern part of Gaza. And that essentially this is a breach of the 1978 Camp David Accords between the two countries. So, I mean, we have analysts, for example, in The Guardian saying this is the worst period in Israeli-Egyptian relations in a very long time. And so questions about, what that means. The Wall Street Journal has a piece that mentions that as Israel has begun deploying troops along Gaza's southern border, that the Egyptian military has given instructions to soldiers at the border to return fire if they are fired on. So that's a serious breach in relations. And we saw that two Egyptian soldiers were killed earlier this week. So lots about how Egypt is suppressing protests that could come from their funerals or public anger around these deaths, and that really trying to work to clamp down on anything that could turn into political unrest in the country.
This places Egypt in a very, very difficult, almost impossible situation, given the role it's been playing in trying to negotiate some sort of peace.
Well, absolutely. I mean, there are former Egyptian high-ranking military officials that spoke to me for the story that said, look, what we need right now is that we just need to return to the negotiations and that will fix everything. But I mean, there is just this huge divide in terms of public sentiment on the ground in Egypt that the government is looking to control, and the kind of official silence that we're seeing about what's happened at the Philadelphia Corridor, and this sort of sense that this is all quite embarrassing for the Egyptian government, that their red lines have been crossed. They've been telling the Israelis not to do this for months. The Israelis have done it. And now, as you say, the Egyptian government is in a rather difficult position, and they're very worried about what this means for public understanding, public anger at home. They're worried about how that embarrassment plays out domestically.
Let's move now to South Africa. The elections are being held, and the ANC, having held a parliamentary majority for, 3 decades, is set to lose this. How's that being covered in the papers, Ruth?
So coverage all across about what a monumental change this would be for South Africa. That's in the words of the Associated Press, about what it means to have the ANC no longer this necessarily dominant party. So it's that the ANC is the early results, because the votes are being counted until Sunday, suggest that the ANC will get below 50% of the vote. AP mentioning that South Africans are waiting with bated breath to see if their country is about to enter a new era. Speculation or sort of a bit of projection in some of the reporting in Reuters, talking about how the ANC might have to consider forming an alliance with one of its major rivals in order to maintain a hold on power, but what this will mean. And all of this comes down to the exact percentage of the vote that it manages to get. It won't make 50, according to the votes that have been counted. It's about a third of the votes so far, but it might manage a result that means it has to have a different kind of coalition. And that's what we're seeing debated across the New York Times and across the media worldwide.
And just explain to us a little bit about what kind of future that South Africa faces with the ANC, likely to lose its majority and likely to have to form a coalition.
Well, I mean, there's lots of discussion about the various different forms of coalition, but the other thing that we're seeing reported is that, voters have said that the reason this has happened is because they're fed up. Literally, someone in the New York Times being quoted as standing outside a polling station saying, "We're fed up." And, the mention that the South African economy is sluggish, there's high youth unemployment, national mood is low. So this idea that South Africans are voting because they want to see change, but what that change will look like is, until Sunday at least, quite uncertain.
And finally, let's talk about a man who was supposed to go to his hearing about having his driving licence suspended, but he dialed in from rather an unusual place.
Yes, this has gone viral for reasons that I think are probably understandable, that this is a man in Michigan who dialed into his court hearing about his suspended driving license on Zoom, where it was clear that he was at the time driving a car. So the full sort of script of this scene playing out in the Washington Post, where the judge asks him, "Mr. Harris, are you driving?" And he says, "Well, actually, I'm pulling into my doctor's office. Just give me a second. I'm parking now." And the full sort of back and forth between these two people, with the judge saying, "I don't even know why he would do that," and ordering him to turn himself into the county jail.
Ruth Michelson, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. The time here in London is just approaching 7:32. You're listening to The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A quick look now at some of today's other headlines. The US President Joe Biden has reportedly given Ukraine permission to use US-supplied weapons to strike targets in Russia. There are limits to what Kyiv can do, with the White House restricting the use of US weapons to the Kharkiv region. Russia has made a number of small gains in Kharkiv in recent weeks. The African National Congress looks set to lose the parliamentary majority it's held for 30 years in South Africa's elections. The party of the late Nelson Mandela looks likely to remain the largest political force, but it's likely the ANC will have to form a coalition with other parties for the first time in the country's post-apartheid history. And China has confirmed it will not be at a peace conference on Ukraine next month. Beijing declined the invitation to the meeting in Switzerland because the conditions for them to attend were not met, including the presence of both Russia and Ukraine. The Swiss government is seeking participation from wide and different parts of the world for the summit. This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. It's 8:33 a.m. in Rotterdam, and we head to the Netherlands now, a country close to getting its first change in Prime Minister in 13 years. The right-wing coalition parties have nominated the Netherlands' former security chief, Dick Schoof, as their preferred candidate. Mr. Schoof is senior in the Department of Justice and, as I've just said, has previously led the Dutch Intelligence and Immigration Services. While Stefan de Vries is the European Affairs correspondent at Euronews and the BNR News Radio, joins me now from Amsterdam. Very good morning to you, Stefan.
Good morning to you.
So just explain to us, how did we get here? It's been a very long and complicated journey to finding a Prime Minister.
Yes, that's an understatement. 6 months ago, over 6 months ago, there were elections, general elections in the Netherlands. And the big winner was the populist party PVV, led by Geert Wilders, the politician who's in Dutch politics already for a quarter of a century. A very polarizing and polarized figure. And the tradition wants that the leader of the largest party is also in charge of selecting the prime minister. Now, that's a very complicated process because there are four parties have been negotiating for over 6 months to form a coalition to come up with ideas for the country. Geert Wilders already wanted to become prime minister himself. The other three parties didn't want to, so Wilders resigned as a candidate. Then he came up with another candidate from the Labour Party, but he was he was involved in some kind of academic fraud. And now suddenly Tuesday, Geert Wilders came up with Dick Schoof, the former chief of the intelligence services. Nobody knew to his name only people that are actually aware of security matters. So there was a big surprise and disbelief and confusion in the Netherlands amongst the Dutch politicians, but also in the media, that this top civil servant was suddenly being presented as the next prime minister of the Netherlands. So it has been a long and bumpy ride with a very unexpected outcome.
Why has this man become the favourite?
Yeah, that's a very good question. It's basically you have to be able to get into Geert Wilders' mind. Dick Schoof was responsible for the security of Geert Wilders. Geert Wilders is the most heavily protected person probably in the Netherlands for over 2 decades already, and Dick Schoof was the person responsible for his protection. So they probably have a close personal link. Geert Wilders trusts him because he trusts him literally with his life. But why he has become a candidate as prime minister, it's completely unknown, because he is a civil servant, a respected civil servant for over 40 years. He's 67 years old, but he has no political experience, no international experience. He had been a member of the Labour Party, but he resigned. He handed in his membership a couple of years ago because he didn't feel longer at home at the Labour Party. But apart from that, no political experience, no international network in politics, and he's not a member of any political party. So a completely an outlier, and it is the question whether this is the person who can lead the Dutch government for the next couple of years.
Is he the man who can take control of a deeply divided country? I mean, he's already said he won't be kowtowing to Geert Wilders, but you've said that he has a close relationship with him, and because he has no political direction, does that leave the Netherlands without one?
Yes, you could say that. Actually, one of the coalition partners, the conservative NSC, is a new party. They have been pleading for an extra parliamentary cabinet, and that means that they want ministers who are not coming from politics, but from the field. So, for instance, a health minister would be a doctor, a justice minister would maybe a former police officer, or something like that. Now, this person, Dick Schoof, is really he comes out of the blue, so he has no ties to politics, which could be seen as an advantage of renewing the politics in the Netherlands. But on the other hand, he is not known for being a people's manager. He has no network. He has very little empathy. I spoke to a few people in the Ministry of Justice, where he also was the highest ranking civil servant. And actually, there was a poll at the ministry amongst people working there, where they could bet on the next prime minister, because it has been going on for 6 months. But Dick Schoof, their own boss, was not on that list. And so everybody was really surprised when his name came up last Tuesday. It is very unlikely that this prime minister will serve for a very long time, also because the new coalition with the 4 parties have a lot of disagreements. It took them a lot of time to come up with a coalition agreement. And it's very unlikely that he is the one who will be able to unite a very polarized society with a lot of challenges. And most of those challenges are actually European. And it is also very hard to imagine that when this prime minister comes to the table in Brussels to negotiate with his 26 other government leader colleagues, that he has something maybe he has something to tell, but the thing is, will he be listened to? Because he's not a member of a political party. He's a civil servant. So many of the elected government leaders of Europe would say, who is he? Who is this grey man? Where does he come from? What does he want? So it will put the Netherlands in a very difficult position in Europe and in an international context. But on the other hand, the departing Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, he said in a reaction that we should give him a chance, and it's very easy to criticize somebody who has never started. And that's the general mood, I think, now in The Hague. Let's give him a chance. But I don't see him serving for a very long time as the Prime Minister of the Netherlands.
Stefan de Vries, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. It's Friday, so it's time for Andrew Mueller's What We Learned.
We learned this week that North Korea had lit upon a new way to be the world's worst neighbour.
Now, over 100 balloons suspected to be filled with waste and attached with excrement have been found across the country.
Indeed, we learned that the weirdo hermit kingdom had now become the nation-state equivalent of that jerk next door who throws all the snails in his garden over the fence into your yard, as hundreds of balloons bearing bagloads of waste were launched across the border, descending upon bemused South Koreans. When we sought enlightenment, as we so very often do, from Rodong Sinmun, the official newspaper of the Workers' Party of Korea, we did not, regrettably, learn much about what the point of all this was, but we did learn that, it says here, agricultural workers in Gangwon province have moved into new houses where, and we quote, they will lead a worthwhile life while enjoying socialist civilization to their heart's content. And a big hello at this juncture to our many listeners in the agricultural sector of Gangwon province. But sticking with the subject of a bewildered population being bombarded with rubbish, we learned from the first full week of the UK's general election campaign, and to be honest, we learned some of this technically late last week, but we'd already filed last week's monologue, and the audio is too good to pass up, so there, that UK Prime Minister, as of this recording, Rishi Sunak, has in common with the vessel which inspired the emetic anthem tootling away in the background of this bit, that he too was looking pretty impressive when he left Southampton. He's from Southampton, keep up, this is very clever, but has come to significant grief upon collision with reality.
I can't wait to see where this goes.
Okay. Tell me more.
Let's
see
where this goes.
We learned, first of all, that following an election announcement that was drowned out both by rain and a heckler with a speaker, that Sunak had clearly decided to launch his campaign at a location that would put unmistakable distance between himself and any suggestion that he was steering a course to disaster through a combination of complacency and hubris. We learned that he had flown to Belfast and visited a section of the city named for the most infamous product of its shipyards, and we learned that one local hack was not about to miss a goal that open.
Prime Minister, we are just yards away from where the Titanic was built and designed. Are you captaining a sinking ship going into this election?
So if you look at what's happened over the past few weeks,
we can only assume that even as Sunak pondered exactly which grotesque punishment he would visit upon whoever suggested associating him quite so intimately with the Thai actual Titanic, he was stoically thinking of all those Conservative votes he would scoop up in Northern Ireland. Important context for overseas listeners, because of reasons, none of the major British parties really field candidates in Northern Ireland. In fairness, the Tories do a bit, but last time out in 2019 they won 0.7% of the vote. Still something to build on, or given the way Sunak's campaign has gone thus far, something to descend to, because we learned that no sooner had Sunak returned from visiting the birthplace of the Titanic and presumably cancelled scheduled visits to Isandlwana, Saratoga, Balaclava and whichever other legendary British failures of leadership and oversight you're having yourself, that he announced this.
That is why we will introduce a bold new model of national service for 18-year-olds.
We learned therefrom that Sunak had determined that his only option was going all in on that section of the electorate born too late to actually serve in World War II, but just in time to watch a lot of movies about it, from which they derived the understanding of the world which has served them ever since, if you're still wondering how Brexit happened. Or we learned that the Conservatives have already embraced that giddy delirium that comes of knowing you're going to get absolutely hosed, and therefore might as well announce any old nonsense. Given that we still have 5 weeks to go, the reintroduction of public hanging and the dispatch of gunboats to Zanzibar can probably not be ruled out with too overt confidence. Still, we learned that Rishi Sunak was not the only British party leader whose campaign had dissolved upon contact with water. We learned that Sir Ed Davey, leader of the Liberal Democrats, had decided to kick off with a spot of paddleboarding, having presumably left it too late to book a more dignified option, like a bouncy castle or an orgy. We learned, however, or so he claimed, that Sir Ed had plunged repeatedly and ungracefully into the drink deliberately to highlight the putrid state of the UK's rivers, lakes and beaches, so probably fair enough. While Sir Ed did testify that the water of Lake Windermere was cold, he is of course to be commended for not attempting to start any kind of fire aboard his canoe-like craft, because, as everybody knows, you can't have your kayak and heat it.
Boo!
Come on, we worked on that all morning.
Boo!
For Monocle Radio, I'm Andrew Mueller.
Thank you, Andrew. You're with The Globalist.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
.46 here in London. It's time now to talk music. Will Hodgkinson joins me down the line. A very good morning to you, Will.
Good morning.
How's the world in Hodgkinson?
It's fine, thank you. Yes, not bad.
Slightly better, I hope, than if you're a homeless person in Edinburgh.
Well, this is Taylor Swift coming to Edinburgh June the 7th, and Shelter Scotland sent a report that homeless people are being sent by taxi to Aberdeen and Glasgow to make way for fans. It's a very strange story because, of course, stadiums are filled regularly with, sporting events and so on. But I found out one of the reasons it's happening is that a lot of Taylor Swift fans are going in groups. One of them might have a ticket, and then a group of friends of 7 or 8 haven't got a ticket, and they're going anyway, just for the fun of it. So it's created a crisis. And yes, it seems like part of the problem is that with temporary accommodation, it's filled at the last minute so that it doesn't become permanent. So, all the spaces, every space in Edinburgh is being filled. So, yeah, it's a real crisis.
And it's not often that I thought that we'd be talking about sort of Scotland's homeless policy on a music slot. But there is something quite important here, which is that if you are homeless in Scotland, you have to be offered emergency temporary accommodation. And this can come in the form of hotels, which is obviously the problem that's being caused for Taylor Swift.
That's exactly right. And that's why they're being sent off to other cities. But I think there's just a huge dichotomy. The Taylor Swift story, which has been running for this year, is the giant boost in economy that travel everywhere. She goes around in American cities and everything. But this is a side of it which no one really considered. And very, very serious. I think far more serious if you're being booted out of temporary accommodation, possibly as a family, than just a pop star who happens to be very, very successful at the moment.
Just explain a little bit more. Has Taylor Swift actually said anything?
No, and I don't think there's no reason in any way that she imagine she might know about it now. She might be, but there's no suggestion that she's got anything to do with it. I don't think she was. It's not part of the policy. It's apparently Shelter saying that it's not the first time this has happened. I wonder if similar things happened. I'm not sure if they happened in Eurovision, during the Liverpool time. I'm not sure, but I think you pinpointed it. The fact that in Scotland, you have to be offered accommodation. This is really the crux of it.
Now let's move to a story which is a sort of a growing swell of voices when it comes to what is happening in Gaza, and we are having a moment when pop musicians and rock musicians are speaking out on politics in a way that arguably we haven't seen for a very long time.
Well, what we'll see all the time are pop stars and rock stars speaking out against, say, Donald Trump, because that's easy. But, Israel-Gaza is far more of a thorny issue. It's always, I think, people in the alternative world, I mean, if you go all the way back to anti-apartheid, the anti-apartheid movement was led by people like Jerry Dammers, who had been in the Specials and so on, and it was, had its own effect. But Dua Lipa is one of the most commercial pop stars in the world at the moment. She's got 88 million followers. And this is where it's unusual. So she has talked about the Israeli genocide. She pointed out that she does not condone what Hamas is doing. She said that in Rolling Stone magazine in October. But, she laid it out in stark terms this week. She said burning children alive can never be justified. And so for someone whose music is completely mainstream, the new album is as pop as it gets. There's nothing political about it whatsoever. So it's interesting that Dua Lipa, who is, who comes from a Kosovan background and so has in her heritage, there's been, this basically comes from civil war. It's interesting that she'd stand out so clearly. I mean, people like Stormzy have talked about it, Paul Weller, but you kind of expect that. It's the fact that it's such a mainstream pop star. I think that's the difference.
And the way that this will galvanise what kind of reaction from her many, many mainstream followers. It is a slight change, or it's a huge change, isn't it? Because we now live in a world where if you are Dua Lipa, you have arguably much more influence than you do if you're a politician.
Well, that's the interesting thing. And of course, she's kept politics out of the music so much. And she's such an entertainment figure, and really a business figure as well. I mean, she's kind of building an entire brand here. So, yes, it's very interesting. I mean, in a way, it's hard to imagine, the rock stalwarts who were once kind of revolutionary, people like the Rolling Stones, you can't quite imagine them coming out in a statement like this. So it's interesting that she did. Yes, it's interesting to see how much it will galvanise fans. And of course, it's extremely, extremely thorny. And, previous to this, she'd been accused of anti-Semitism, for speaking out against this. So it's very, very, very difficult. And it's interesting that she made such a stark it wasn't just like hold hands for peace. It was a very, very stark statement.
And I'm trying to work out when the last time music got so political. It's been a very long time.
I think it was anti-apartheid. I mean, which was early 80s. I may be wrong. There's always been musicians speaking out against war, but it tends to come from the more politicized side of things. It tends to come from, folk music, rock music, or people like Billy Bragg. It's quite unusual for pop stars of this type to, maybe Madonna. I'm not sure. It's interesting, especially because of Dua Lipa's image is such a kind of shiny, rather sort of, everything is on the surface with Dua Lipa. That's what she's promoted. So to have this other side, which is totally separate from the music, is really interesting.
Will Hodgkinson, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Globalist. Finally, for those heading to France this summer for the Olympics, as well as looking forward to taking part in the world's greatest sporting contest, those competing in the Games may probably have been looking forward to a decent spot of French food. But on the menu this year will be food that those familiar with traditional French cuisines may not immediately recognise. Well, Bénédicte Paviot is the UK correspondent for France 24. I'm delighted to say she joins me now on the line. A very good morning to you, Bénédicte.
Good morning.
So what's on, what's off the menu?
Well, what is very definitely off are what the British call chips, what the French call frites or pommes frites, and that is because they are deemed too risky. They're a far risk with fat fryers. It's also not very super environmentally friendly in what will be a very, very busy Olympic Games and Paralympics. So, catering for 45,000 meals a day. You've got two chefs that work for this company called Sodexo Live, and they have already catered in the past for 15 Super Bowls and 36 Roland Garros tennis tournaments in France. So they're used to catering for a lot of meals, and they want to get this right.
So what are they getting right? Because this is something that has to be pitched in a very modern French way.
Indeed. So they will be getting about 500 different dishes in the Olympic Village in Saint-Denis, just north of Paris. So not, as you point out, the classic French cuisine of elaborate sauces and lots of melted butter. Instead, they're going to have things like vegetarian hot dogs, quinoa muesli. Also on the menu, there will be sweet potatoes with hummus, cabbage pickles, beetroot falafel, grilled eggplant with smoked paprika. I'm hoping I'm making people hungry by now. But of course, rest assured, there will be French cheeses, blanquette de veal, but with, attention, a lightened sauce. And of course, there will be lots of baguettes. And I gather there'll even be encouragement for athletes to be able to, with a master baker, learn to bake baguettes.
How much is this a departure of France's food from its traditions, given the fact that when you go to Paris nowadays, it seems to be absolutely in the throes of the most glorious explosion of different tastes and cultures?
Yes, it's true. French cuisine, lots of fusion involved now also in that. But when you're feeding 15,000 athletes from all over the world with very different cultures, very different habits, who have very exacting nutritionists, you've got more than 200 nationalities who are going to be in Paris. There has to be also other types of food. So I understand there'll be 6 grab-and-go outlets with Asian cuisine, Afro-Caribbean dishes, vegetarian shawarma, hamburgers, whether meat, vegetarian, or a combination of the two, Middle Eastern food, halal cuisine, kosher food, also available on demand. And it is France, its culture, its tradition, its hospitality that is on show and very much wanting to plan and prepare and deliver a really spectacular sports show, but also cultural food and hospitality show.
So tell us a little bit more about the chefs who are in charge of this, Stéphane Chicheri and Charles Gouyoy. Who are they and why have they decided to take this stance?
Well, they are chefs that are very practiced and indeed work for this huge Sodexo company. Sodexo itself employs 420,000 people, I understand, in food services and facility management worldwide. So they're known, of course, but they're not known in the way that, for example, chefs like Alain Ducasse are well known. But they are becoming very well known because not just the French press, but the entire world's press is interested in making sure that people will be catered for well. And of course, France is making sure that it is in the weeks before the spectacular end of July and August, so the Olympics and the Paralympics sport festival, really very much wanting to show that things are being planned very, very carefully. And they also want to show that it's also about being careful with the environment. So there'll be no avocados because it's considered that they're imported from a great distance and consume a lot of water. France wanting to take its environmental responsibilities very seriously, banning throwaway cutlery and plates. Also, I understand that, importantly, 80% of ingredients will be French, 25% from within 155 miles of Paris. So the target, clearly, for the French authorities is to halve the carbon imprint of the Tokyo or London Olympics.
Bénédicte Paviot, thank you so much for joining us on The Globalist. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests, and thanks too to the producers Vincent McAviney, Tom Webb and Christy O'Grady. Our researcher was George Ruskin and our studio manager Lily Austin. After the headlines, there's more music on the way. The briefing is live at midday here in London. The Globalist returns at the same time on Monday. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening. Have a great weekend.